There is something very strange about belly fat that most people have never heard about. Two people can stand next to each other with the same weight and the same height, but one person is completely healthy, while the other is slowly moving toward diabetes, fatty liver, and heart disease. The difference is not in body weight, but in the type of fat that is lying deep inside their body. That fat is called visceral fat. And the frightening thing is that you cannot see it in the mirror. Most of us grow up with a very simple idea that fat is bad. But biology is not that simple, because the human body actually needs fat to survive. Many important hormones in the body are created from cholesterol and lipids. Hormones such as testosterone, estrogen, and progesterone all begin from fat molecules. And fat also helps insulate the body, protect internal organs, and store energy when it is needed. Because of this, the problem is not whether fat exists or not. The real question is where that fat is located. In science, body fat is usually divided into two main types. The first type is subcutaneous fat, which is the layer of fat that sits just beneath the skin. And when you gently pinch the skin around your stomach or arms and feel a soft layer underneath, that is subcutaneous fat. And this type of fat is not always harmful because it acts as a protective cushion for the body and helps regulate body temperature. The second type, and the real focus of today's discussion, is visceral fat, a type of fat that sits deep inside the abdominal cavity and surrounds important organs such as the liver, intestines, kidneys, and endocrine glands. A small amount of visceral fat is completely normal because it acts like a biological cushion that protects internal organs. But when this layer begins to accumulate excessively, everything changes because visceral fat is not simply a storage depot for energy. It behaves almost like a real endocrine organ. That means it has the ability to release chemical signals that influence the entire body. And scientists have discovered that visceral fat releases several inflammatory molecules such as interleukin-6 and tumor necrosis factor alpha, substances that increase a condition known as chronic low-grade inflammation inside the body, a silent form of inflammation that is associated with many modern diseases. This is why visceral fat is strongly linked to type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, fatty liver disease, and metabolic syndrome. And a well-known study from the Framingham Heart Study showed that the amount of visceral fat measured by computed tomography scans predicted the risk of heart disease more accurately than body mass index. This leads to an interesting paradox, where two individuals may have the same body weight, but the person with higher visceral fat may carry a much greater health risk. Because of this, it is possible for someone to appear not very overweight, but still carry a significant amount of visceral fat. And researchers even use a term for this phenomenon called skinny fat, which means a person can appear thin on the outside while having a considerable amount of visceral fat on the inside. This is one of the reasons many people feel confused, because they do not feel like they eat excessively and they do not consider themselves overweight. Yet, their waistline continues to grow over time. And the important question then becomes why the body chooses to store fat in the most dangerous location in the first place. The answer does not lie only in calories, but in the hormonal systems and biological signals inside the body. Because visceral fat tends to increase when three major systems begin to lose balance, including insulin, which is the hormone responsible for controlling blood sugar and storing energy, cortisol, which is the hormone associated with stress, and the circadian rhythm, which is the internal biological clock that regulates sleep, hormones, and metabolism. When these systems operate in harmony, the body can manage energy efficiently. But when they begin to fall out of rhythm because of chronic stress, modern eating patterns, lack of movement, or poor sleep, the body activates an ancient survival mechanism that begins to store energy around vital organs. And that stored energy becomes visceral fat. From an evolutionary perspective, this response actually makes perfect sense, because if the body believes it is living in a stressful environment or facing a shortage of energy, storing fat around vital organs becomes a survival strategy. But in the modern world, this survival mechanism has become a problem because we are no longer living in an environment of energy scarcity. Instead, we live in an environment filled with ultra-processed food, chronic stress, artificial lighting, and very little physical movement. These signals constantly tell the body that it should continue storing energy, and the result often appears in a place that is very familiar to most people: the waistline. The important thing to understand is that belly fat is not only an issue of appearance, but a biological signal. A signal that the metabolic systems inside the body are beginning to lose balance. And in the next part of this video, we will explore this mechanism in greater detail to understand what truly happens inside the body when visceral fat begins to accumulate and why hormones such as insulin and cortisol can transform the US abdominal area into the most dangerous storage site for energy in the human body. To understand why visceral fat accumulates, we need to move beyond the idea of calories and look at the biology that controls how the body stores energy. The human body does not simply store fat because food exists. It stores fat because hormonal signals tell it to do so. Among the many hormones involved in metabolism, 3 systems play a central role in visceral fat accumulation: insulin, cortisol, and chronic inflammation. When these systems fall out of balance, the body begins shifting energy towards storage rather than usage. And the abdomen becomes the most common location for that storage. The first and most important hormone in this process is insulin. Insulin is responsible for regulating blood sugar and directing how the body uses or stores energy. When we eat carbohydrates, especially refined carbohydrates such as sugar, white flour, and ultra-processed foods, blood glucose rises. In response, the pancreas releases insulin, which moves glucose from the bloodstream into the cells. This process is essential for survival because cells require glucose for energy. However, when insulin levels remain elevated for long periods of time, the metabolic system begins to change. Instead of burning stored energy, the body prioritizes storing energy. Excess glucose is converted into fat, and much of that fat tends to accumulate around the abdominal organs. Over time, constantly high insulin levels can also lead to a condition known as insulin resistance. In this state, cells become less responsive to insulin, forcing the body to produce even more of the hormone to control blood sugar. This creates a metabolic loop where higher insulin drives more fat storage, and increased visceral fat further worsens insulin resistance. Many metabolic diseases begin inside this cycle, which is why visceral fat is strongly linked to type 2 diabetes and metabolic syndrome. The second major factor is cortisol. The hormone associated with stress, cortisol plays an important role in survival because it helps the body respond to physical or psychological threats. When cortisol rises, it increases blood sugar and mobilizes energy so the body can react quickly. In short bursts, this system is extremely useful. The problem appears when stress becomes chronic and cortisol remains elevated for long periods. Under these conditions, the body interprets stress as a signal of uncertainty and potential danger. From an evolutionary perspective, storing energy near vital organs becomes a protective strategy. As a result, cortisol encourages fat deposition specifically in the abdominal region, which is why long-term psychological stress is often associated with increasing waist circumference, even when calorie intake does not change dramatically. The third mechanism involves inflammation. Unlike subcutaneous fat, Visceral fat is metabolically active tissue. It releases signaling molecules known as inflammatory cytokines, including interleukin-6 and tumor necrosis factor alpha. These compounds increase systemic inflammation inside the body and interfere with normal metabolic signaling. Chronic inflammation disrupts insulin sensitivity, alters hormone balance, and places additional stress on organs such as the liver. This is one reason visceral fat is closely connected to fatty liver disease, cardiovascular disease, and other metabolic disorders. When these three systems interact with one another, a powerful biological feedback loop forms. Elevated insulin encourages fat storage. Chronic stress increases cortisol, which further promotes abdominal fat accumulation. Expanding visceral fat then releases inflammatory signals that worsen insulin resistance and metabolic dysfunction. What begins as a small imbalance in lifestyle or environment can gradually develop into a deeper metabolic disruption that is difficult to reverse. Understanding this mechanism changes the way we think about belly fat. It is not simply the result of overeating or lack of willpower. It is the visible outcome of a complex hormonal and metabolic network responding to stress, diet, and modern living conditions. When insulin, cortisol, and inflammation remain elevated for long periods, the body begins to treat the abdominal cavity as its preferred storage site for energy. And that is how visceral fat slowly builds over time. To understand why visceral fat has become so common today, we need to look at something deeper than individual habits. The human body evolved in an environment that was completely different from the one we live in now. For most of human history, food was unpredictable. Physical movement was constant, and the natural rhythm of sunlight and darkness regulated our biology. The metabolic systems that control fat storage developed under those conditions, but in the modern world, the signals that reach our body every day are very different. And those signals quietly push the metabolism towards storing fat rather than burning it. One of the strongest signals comes from the modern food environment. Highly processed foods are designed to be easy to consume and extremely palatable, but they often combine refined carbohydrates, added sugars, and industrial fats in ways that keep insulin levels elevated. When meals frequently trigger large spikes in blood glucose, insulin must repeatedly rise to control it. Over time, this constant cycle begins to shift the metabolic balance toward storage. Instead of allowing the body to transition into periods of fat burning between meals, the system remains in a state where energy is continually being stored because visceral fat responds strongly to hormonal signals such as insulin. The abdominal cavity becomes one of the primary locations where this excess energy accumulates. At the same time, modern lifestyles dramatically reduce physical movement. The human body was built to move for many hours each day, whether through walking, carrying, climbing, or other forms of activity. Muscle tissue plays a central role in metabolism because it is one of the largest consumers of glucose in the body. When muscles contract, they absorb glucose from the bloodstream and improve insulin sensitivity. However, when daily movement declines, this metabolic advantage disappears. Glucose remains in circulation longer. Insulin stays elevated for extended periods, and the body becomes more likely to convert unused energy into stored fat. Over time, reduced movement quietly shifts the metabolic environment toward fat accumulation, particularly in the abdominal region. Another powerful influence comes from the way modern environments disrupt the body's natural biological clock. Humans evolved under a consistent cycle of daylight and darkness that shaped hormone production, sleep patterns, and metabolism. The circadian rhythm coordinates when the body releases hormones such as insulin, cortisol, and melatonin, and these signals influence how energy is used throughout the day. In the modern world, artificial lighting extends daytime far into the night, and exposure to bright screens introduces large amounts of blue light after sunset. This light suppresses melatonin and interferes with the signals that normally prepare the body for sleep and metabolic recovery. When circadian rhythms are disrupted repeatedly, metabolic regulation begins to weaken. Studies have shown that irregular sleep patterns and nighttime light exposure are associated with higher risks of obesity, insulin resistance, and increased visceral fat. Stress is another constant feature of modern life that amplifies these effects. While short periods of stress can be beneficial for survival, long-term psychological pressure keeps cortisol elevated and maintains the body in a prolonged state of alertness. Under these conditions, the body behaves as though it must prepare for ongoing uncertainty. And one of the ways it prepares is by storing energy around vital organs. The combination of elevated cortisol, irregular sleep, and frequent insulin spikes forms a biological environment that encourages visceral fat to accumulate gradually over time. When all of these signals are combined, the picture becomes clear. Modern life constantly delivers messages to the body that favor storage over expenditure. Highly processed foods raise insulin. Sedentary routines reduce glucose utilization. Artificial lighting disrupts circadian rhythms. And chronic stress elevates cortisol. None of these factors alone guarantees visceral fat accumulation. But together, they create a metabolic landscape where abdominal fat becomes increasingly common. The body is not malfunctioning when this happens. It is responding exactly as its biological programming instructs it to respond to the signals it receives. Recognizing this pattern is important because it changes the way we approach the problem. Visceral fat is not simply the result of a single behavior, but the outcome of multiple environmental signals interacting with the body's hormonal systems. When these signals consistently push metabolism towards storage, the waistline becomes the place where that story eventually appears. In the final part of this video, we will look at how to reverse those signals and create conditions that allow the body to gradually reduce visceral fat and restore metabolic balance. Once we understand why visceral fat appears, the next question becomes much simpler. How do we change the signals that cause the body to store it in the first place? The key point is that the body rarely removes visceral fat through extreme effort or sudden changes. Instead, it responds to consistent biological signals that gradually shift metabolism from storage back toward energy use. When insulin levels stabilize, stress signals decrease, and circadian rhythms return to balance. The body slowly begins to use the stored energy surrounding the organs. This is why effective strategies for reducing visceral fat are not built around short-term intensity, but around restoring the metabolic environment the human body was originally designed for. The first lever is nutrition. The goal is not simply to eat less food, but to reduce the metabolic signals that drive continuous insulin spikes. Meals built around whole foods, balanced protein intake, healthy fats, and moderate carbohydrates allow blood glucose to rise more slowly and reduce the need for large insulin responses. When insulin remains lower between meals, the body regains the ability to access stored fat for energy. Research in metabolic science repeatedly shows that diets emphasizing whole foods, sufficient protein, and lower intake of refined carbohydrates tend to reduce visceral fat more effectively than approaches focused only on calorie counting. The reason is simple. Insulin stability allows the body to switch from storage mode to energy usage. The second lever is movement. Physical activity does far more than burn calories during exercise. Muscle contractions increase glucose uptake directly from the bloodstream and improve insulin sensitivity across the entire body. When muscles regularly demand energy, the metabolic system becomes more efficient at clearing glucose and using stored fuel. Over time, this improves hormonal balance and reduces the metabolic conditions that favor abdominal fat accumulation. Even moderate and consistent movement, such as walking, resistance training, or aerobic activity, can produce meaningful changes in metabolic health when practiced regularly. The third lever involves restoring circadian rhythm. The human body depends on daily cycles of light and darkness to coordinate hormones, sleep, and metabolic repair. Exposure to natural daylight during the morning helps synchronize the biological clock and regulates cortisol release, while reduced exposure to bright artificial light during the evening allows melatonin production to rise and supports restorative sleep. When sleep quality improves and circadian signals stabilize, the body becomes better able to regulate appetite hormones, insulin sensitivity, and energy balance. Over time, this environment supports gradual reductions in visceral fat without forcing the body into constant metabolic stress. When these three signals begin working together, the body slowly changes direction. Stable insulin reduces the drive to store energy. Regular movement improves metabolic flexibility. Restored circadian rhythms allow hormones to operate according to their natural cycles. Instead of continuously accumulating energy around vital organs, the body begins to access those reserves when they are needed. The process is rarely immediate, but it is remarkably consistent when the underlying signals remain stable. Visceral fat is often misunderstood as a simple consequence of overeating or lack of discipline. But the science tells a more complex story. It is not merely a layer of stored energy, but an active metabolic tissue that responds to hormonal signals, stress, and environmental conditions. When insulin remains elevated, when stress keeps cortisol high, and when modern lifestyles disrupt sleep and biological rhythms, the body gradually shifts towards storing energy in the abdominal cavity. The waistline becomes the visible sign of a deeper metabolic imbalance. But this also means the opposite is true. When the signals change, the biology begins to change as well. Balanced nutrition stabilizes insulin. Consistent movement improves metabolic flexibility, and healthy circadian rhythms restore hormonal regulation. Under these conditions, the body slowly returns to a state where energy is used rather than stored, and visceral fat begins to decline naturally over time. The most important insight is that the human body is not working against us. It is responding to the signals it receives every day. When those signals support metabolic balance instead of constant stress, the systems that control energy, hormones, and fat storage begin to move in a healthier direction. Understanding this shift allows us to approach visceral fat not as an enemy to fight, but as a signal that can guide us toward restoring the biological environment our bodies were designed to thrive in.